In a surprising royal turn that has drawn attention around the world, Prince William has reportedly made a significant move involving one of the most emotional symbols tied to Princess Diana. The decision connected to Diana's famous sapphire ring has sparked a wave of discussion about her legacy, William's growing role, and the shifting balance of influence inside the royal family. So why would William take this step now? And what does this unexpected move suggest about his view of the monarchy and the people closest to the crown? Some viewers are already asking whether he made the right call by reclaiming Diana's ring, or whether the timing may have gone too far. To understand the story, the setting matters. William's visit to the royal vault is where things seem to take a dramatic turn. Picture the officer in charge of one of the most secure rooms inside Windsor Castle when Prince William suddenly arrives with no appointment, no senior aides, and no advance notice. That would be enough to surprise anyone. Matters involving priceless royal treasures are usually handled through planned meetings, formal records, and several layers of palace approval. This visit, according to the account being discussed online, did not follow that usual pattern at all. William was not there to wait around for a long process or sit through a routine discussion. He appeared ready to act immediately. From the moment he stepped through the vault doors, it seemed clear that William had already settled on his decision. He was carrying only one document, and his calm but focused expression suggested this was not a snap choice, but something he had been thinking through well before arriving. That document was a formally prepared custodial transfer order, one that William had personally reviewed, signed, and brought with him. He apparently wanted there to be no confusion about who was making the call, or why it was being made. At the center of the discussion was one of the most recognized pieces of jewelry in royal history, Princess Diana's iconic sapphire engagement ring. For months, the ring had remained in a somewhat unusual position inside the royal vault. It was being carefully safeguarded, but it had never been formally placed under the direct authority of William and Catherine's household. At the same time, it had not been assigned elsewhere either. William had reportedly accepted that arrangement because he believed the long-standing family understanding was clear, that Diana's personal belongings should stay with her children. But things appeared to shift just 48 hours earlier. According to the version being discussed online, a senior aide brought William information that made him realize the uncertainty around Diana's collection could potentially be used in ways he had not expected. Rather than let that situation continue, he decided to move quickly, determined to clear up the confusion and protect his mother's legacy once and for all. William's unexpected arrival at the royal vault reportedly caught the officer in charge off guard. But what could have pushed him to show up so suddenly? Was there something urgent that needed his attention, or was this just one of those rare visits to the vault? The details being discussed make the moment even more intriguing, and the request that brought William into this situation is where the story really starts to turn. According to the reports being circulated, the information he received was not treated as just another routine palace update that could wait until later. It suggested that Camilla's household had submitted a formal request, one that could have affected how Diana's personal belongings were handled going forward. At first, it may have looked like a standard administrative review, but once William looked more closely, he reportedly saw that the potential impact went far beyond routine paperwork. The request involved moving Diana's personal collection into a different administrative category known as a Crown-Associated Ceremonial Asset. If that request was approved, it could have changed more than just the paperwork, and that is exactly why people online have been paying close attention. For those following the story, the concern was not simply about where the ring sat in the vault, but about what kind of control, access, and oversight might come with a new classification. That is where William's reaction starts to make sense in the way commentators are describing it. According to the discussion circulating online, he may have seen the proposal as something that could slowly shift Diana's personal items away from the family line he believed they should remain with. And once that idea took hold, it reportedly became less about routine administration and more about a direct test of how far the palace would go. So now the focus is on what happens next inside that tightly controlled royal system. The people watching this unfold are not just interested in the ring itself. They want to know whether William's move signals a firmer approach to protecting Diana's legacy, or whether this dispute reflects deeper tensions behind palace doors. While the title may have sounded technical and harmless, the possible impact was anything but small. Instead of staying within the family understanding that had been in place for years, Diana's belongings could have been moved under the management structure of the reigning monarch's household. In practical terms, that could mean key decisions about Diana's jewelry, letters, clothing, and other personal keepsakes might eventually be handled through official channels tied to the king's household. And because Camilla's office operates closely within that same structure, observers pointed out that it could have given her household a greater degree of influence over items with a deeply personal connection to William's mother. For William, this was never just about a well-known sapphire ring sitting inside a vault. He seemed to understand that the issue went much further. It was about who would have the power to shape the future of Diana's personal story and how her memory would be carried forward for later generations. Rather than responding with public anger or turning it into a direct dispute, William reportedly took a different route. Over the next 2 days, he reportedly worked on a careful response that would deal with the bigger issue, not just the immediate request. Instead of simply pushing back on one move, he seemed focused on creating a lasting safeguard that could help prevent similar situations from coming up again. In other words, his aim was not only to protect one treasured item, but to protect Diana's wider legacy. William then rushed to the royal vault after learning, according to the version being discussed, that Camilla's household planned to move Princess Diana's personal collection into a very different administrative category. But why did Diana's ring matter so much that it pushed William to act this quickly? What made this piece of jewelry so meaningful to him, to his brother, and of course, to Diana herself? Let's take a closer look. The value of Diana's sapphire ring goes far beyond what most people see on the surface. Around the world, many recognize the famous engagement ring because Catherine has worn it for years. But inside the royal family, that ring stands for much more than diamonds and an elegant design. It is tied to memory, emotion, and a deep connection to one of the most widely remembered figures in modern royal history. The ring's story began in 1981, when Charles gave it to Diana after their engagement was announced. From that point on, the ring became closely tied to Diana's public image. She wore it during some of her happiest years as a young princess, but it also stayed with her through some of the most difficult and painful parts of her marriage. It showed up in countless photographs and slowly grew into a powerful symbol of the very public journey she lived inside the royal family. After Diana's tragic passing, the ring carried even more emotional weight. For many people, it became one of the most personal reminders connected to her memory. William later said that he kept the ring close after losing his mother, and at one point he even wore it on a chain around his neck. Harry also had a connection to the ring before William eventually chose it for one of the most important moments of his own life. When William proposed to Catherine in Kenya in 2010, he intentionally used Diana's sapphire ring because he wanted his mother to be part of that moment. He explained that, even though Diana was no longer there, the ring helped keep her presence with him. Since then, Catherine has worn it at major royal events, making it one of the most recognizable pieces of jewelry anywhere. That is exactly why the discussion around this move has stayed so intense online. For many viewers, the ring is not just a royal accessory. It is tied to memory, family history, and the way Diana is remembered in public. So when people hear claims that a formal change could affect how those personal items are managed, it naturally raises questions about control, access, and respect for the meaning behind them. Commentators have pointed out that this kind of dispute is rarely only about one object. It can quickly become a bigger conversation about who gets to decide what happens next, whose voice carries more weight, and whether old family understandings are being protected or quietly challenged. That is why William's reported response has been read by some as more than a simple reaction. It looks, at least in online discussion, like a move to draw a clear boundary. And because the ring already carries so much emotional history, even the suggestion of a change has been enough to keep people debating every detail. Supporters of William see it as a protective step, while others question whether the timing and the broader implications were handled carefully. The result is a story that keeps circling back to the same core issue: how Diana's legacy is preserved, and who ultimately gets to shape that legacy moving forward. But for William, Diana's ring has reportedly meant far more than what people see at public events. He has never treated it like just another royal item sitting under palace control. To him, it stands for his mother's story, her memory, and the bond she still has with her family. That is why, in the version being discussed online, he felt it needed protection beyond a simple family understanding, because sometimes an unwritten promise is not enough. At some point, it has to be made permanent. From William's perspective, Diana's wider collection represents deeply personal pieces of his mother's life and history, items that should always be handled with care. But what kind of strategy would he use to protect that legacy, and how far was he willing to go to make sure her memory and image could not be undermined? Let's look at the details. The rule change appears to have been the real turning point. Instead of turning it into a public standoff or getting pulled into endless palace talk, William's approach, according to the story being examined, seemed aimed at something much larger, a lasting solution. Rather than just pushing back on one request at a time, he reportedly wanted to close the gap that had allowed uncertainty around Diana's possessions to exist in the first place. The idea was simple, but it carried real weight. A formal custodial arrangement would place Diana's personal collection under the direct care of William and Catherine's household, so any decision involving those treasured items would need William's written approval before moving ahead. That would keep Diana's jewelry, personal belongings, and other meaningful pieces tied to the family members who had the closest personal connection to her. When the vault officer looked over the paperwork, it reportedly all seemed carefully prepared. The signatures were there, the required steps had been followed, and the documents carried the kind of seriousness expected with a major royal decision. This was not just a routine request asking for someone else to sign off. Instead, it signaled a clear statement of responsibility from the future king over something deeply linked to his mother's memory. Then came the moment everyone involved recognized as the key step. Diana's famous sapphire ring was brought out from secure storage. William signed the official register, finishing the transfer process. For a brief moment, he reportedly stood there quietly with the case in his hands. He did not open it, and he did not need to. The ring meant much more than a valuable piece of jewelry. To him, it represented Diana's extraordinary life, the painful parts of her journey, the love she had for her children, and the bond William has carried with him since losing his mother. After a few moments, he carefully put the case aside, thanked the officer, and left Windsor. Whether people see it as a personal promise or an institutional decision, the message was hard to miss. Diana's legacy, in William's view, deserved long-term protection, not temporary arrangements that could shift over time. According to the account being discussed, William had set up a legally binding custodial transfer that placed Diana's personal collection under the protection of his household. But would the rest of the royal family accept that decision? Who might have been caught off guard by the move? And had William quietly outmaneuvered someone inside the royal household? Let's look at what happened next. The letter that nobody expected. The biggest moment, though, did not happen inside the vault. It came afterward, when the effects of William's decision started reaching the wider royal household. According to the story being examined, not long after William left Windsor Castle, the palace's usual administrative system handled the official notice, confirming that the transfer had gone through. That message was then sent through the normal channels to the relevant royal offices, including Camilla's household, and that was the point when the situation became impossible to overlook. It was no longer just a discussion, a proposal, or a request waiting for approval. It had become an official decision, now recorded in the palace system. And that is where the tension really starts to build, because once an official notice moves through the palace system, people begin reading far more into it than just paperwork. In online discussions, some viewers see that kind of step as a sign that the matter had already been decided behind the scenes, while others say it simply reflects how formal royal administration works. Still, the reaction has been intense because the story touches something bigger than procedure. It is not just about where a piece of jewelry ends up, it is about who gets to protect Diana's memory, who has the authority to handle her personal collection, and how much influence different parts of the family may have in that process. That is why the discussion has stayed so active, even as the details remain framed by commentary and disputed claims. For critics, the timing alone raises questions about whether this was meant to send a message. For supporters, it looks like a careful move to preserve what they see as a deeply meaningful legacy. Either way, the transfer notice changed the conversation from private family handling to a wider public debate, and that shift is exactly what kept people watching closely. When Camilla reportedly received the document, she did not react publicly right away. Instead, she went through every line carefully, making sure she understood exactly what the notice was saying. People familiar with the situation claimed she placed the paper on her desk and sat alone with it for several minutes, quietly weighing what the decision could mean. There was no immediate phone call, no fast reply, and no public comment. That silence itself made many viewers think she understood this was about more than one item of jewelry. In online discussions, the document was seen as pointing to a much bigger shift in how Diana's personal legacy might be handled going forward. After that moment of reflection, Camilla reportedly started looking for answers. She was said to have asked for an urgent conversation with King Charles, requested the full paperwork tied to the collection review, and wanted to know who inside the palace had already been told about the transfer before the notice reached her. That last question, according to the discussion online, said a lot. Camilla was not only trying to understand what had happened, she also wanted to know who knew first, how widely the news had already spread, and whether the situation had moved beyond her ability to shape it. By the time those questions were being raised, the dynamic had already shifted. The decision had now moved from a private disagreement into an official palace record, which made it much harder to brush aside or undo. After hearing about the transfer, Camilla reportedly asked for an urgent meeting with the king to go over the entire process, but what would actually come out of that conversation? Would William be called in to explain why he made the move? Or, after Charles reviewed the paperwork, would he ultimately stand by William's actions? That is where the story gets especially tense. Charles faces the impossible choice. By the time Camilla entered King Charles's private study, the situation had already gone further than she seems to have expected. According to the account being discussed, the king had already spent time looking over the transfer documents himself. He checked the process, examined how the decision had been handled, and concluded that William had followed the required steps to formally safeguard Diana's personal collection. During the private discussion that followed, Camilla reportedly made her concerns clear. She argued that a matter this significant should have involved direct consultation with the king and her household before it was finalized. From her point of view, the original request had seemed like part of a normal palace review, not an effort to challenge William's connection to his mother's belongings. She felt his reply had taken what should have been a straightforward administrative matter and pushed it into something far more serious than necessary. Charles listened closely as she laid out her concerns. He did not cut her off, and he let her voice her frustration all the way through. But when the discussion reached its key point, he reportedly made his stance clear. The transfer would not be undone. According to the account being discussed, Charles was not treating this as a choice between his wife and his son. Instead, he seemed to accept that William had acted within his authority, followed the proper steps, and put a formal arrangement in place tied to his late mother's personal legacy. The king also reportedly noted that there had always been an understood family context around Diana's belongings. People close to the situation had long recognized that these items carried deep personal meaning for William and his brother. Trying to handle them through a separate administrative path, even if unintentionally, had created tension with that long-standing understanding. After nearly an hour of discussion, Camilla reportedly left the room without getting the result she had hoped for. The transfer stayed in place, and William's decision appeared to stand even more firmly than before. What started as a dispute over one collection had now grown into a much bigger conversation about family, legacy, and the future direction of the monarchy. And that is exactly why the online reaction has not cooled down. For many viewers, the issue is no longer just about one royal decision, it is about what that decision seems to signal inside the wider family structure. Some people online read the outcome as William quietly asserting himself in a way that had not been seen before, while others argue it simply showed a formal process playing out behind closed palace doors. Either way, the discussion has kept circling back to Diana, because anything tied to her name still carries a strong emotional pull. Supporters of William say the collection should remain closely protected, especially when the items are viewed as part of his personal connection to his mother. Critics, on the other hand, question whether the matter became too symbolic, too personal, and too public for what was supposed to be an internal royal procedure. That split in reaction is what makes the story feel so heavy. It is not just the paperwork itself, it is the meaning people attach to it, and the way every step seems to be read as a sign of shifting influence. As the conversation keeps moving online, the real focus has become less about the notice itself and more about what it suggests for the balance of authority around the crown. Beyond King Charles reportedly laying out why William's actions were seen as justified, the bigger question became how William himself felt after what some online viewers framed as a major win for his mother. And what kind of long-term plan did he quietly set in motion to make sure Diana's legacy would not be diluted, overlooked, or interfered with again? That is where the story shifts, the private conversation. When William finally got back home, what had happened at Windsor was no longer being discussed as just a matter of documents, procedure, or palace handling. It had turned into something far more personal. According to the account being discussed, William sat down with Catherine and walked her through everything from the beginning. He talked about the information he had received, the important note that changed how he viewed the situation, the 2 days he spent getting ready to respond, and why he chose to go to Windsor himself instead of leaving it to palace staff. He went over each step, from the moment the vault officer reviewed the paperwork to the moment the transfer was officially entered. Catherine listened closely and let him speak without cutting in. She seemed to understand this was not just another royal duty. For William, it was tied to something much deeper: his mother, her memory, and the promise he has carried since losing her. After hearing everything, Catherine asked him one simple but powerful question: "How do you feel?" William reportedly admitted that, in some ways, he felt a sense of relief. In his view, something that should have been handled years earlier had finally been put in place. What seemed to bother him most was not the decision itself, but the fact that it took a dispute over procedure to push the family into creating official protection for something that had always carried deep personal meaning. Catherine understood exactly what he was saying. She reminded him that the most important things cannot always be protected by trust alone. Diana's belongings carried too much history, too much emotion, and too much public attention to rest only on private understandings or informal assumptions. They needed a clear structure, something that could safeguard them for years to come. William agreed. The new documentation was not only about the present moment, it was also about making sure George, Charlotte, and Louis would one day have the freedom to decide how their grandmother's belongings should be remembered and preserved. After a brief, quiet pause, William reportedly opened up about the real reason behind his move. Beyond the paperwork, beyond the palace tension, and beyond all the online commentary, he had gone to Windsor for one person: Diana. Catherine encouraged William to take a firm step to protect Diana's legacy, but how would he turn that advice into action? And what did securing the transfer of his mother's ring really mean to him? Now, let's look at how William changed the rules in a way that could have a lasting impact, and why the bigger victory may have had less to do with Diana's ring itself. Even though public attention naturally centered on Diana's famous sapphire ring, the real importance of William's decision went well beyond one piece of jewelry. It was not simply about where the ring would be kept, or who could access it. According to the story being examined, the move reportedly created a much broader layer of protection around Diana's entire personal collection. The key shift was that future decisions involving her belongings would no longer rely on informal understandings or private arrangements. Instead, any request connected to her jewelry, personal items, or other treasured possessions would now need written approval from William before anything could move forward. That change replaced years of uncertainty with a much clearer structure, one that left far less room for confusion. Inside the palace, the move was also seen by some as a glimpse into how William handles authority and responsibility. Rather than reacting publicly or letting emotion steer the moment, he reportedly chose a quieter approach that was more deliberate and more permanent. He looked at the situation closely, followed the proper steps, and put in place a solution meant to hold up over time. That is what made William's decision stand out even more. Instead of just settling one disagreement or responding to a single incident, he seemed focused on creating something that would last. And that is exactly why the conversation online has stayed so intense. For some viewers, this was never just about one ring or one paperwork change. It was about what kind of signal William was sending by making the process more formal and more firmly under his control. Others saw it as a practical step, one that simply put clearer boundaries around items tied to Diana's memory. The reaction matters because it shows how quickly a private royal decision can turn into a wider debate about legacy, trust, and authority. Once people started connecting the move to Diana, the discussion became bigger than the object itself. Supporters framed it as a way to protect something meaningful, while critics questioned whether the timing and manner of the change made the moment feel more symbolic than necessary. That tension is what keeps the story moving. Every detail is being read through a different lens, and every new layer seems to deepen the public interest rather than calm it down. So the focus now shifts to what this kind of structure means going forward, and how much control William may have wanted to secure behind the scenes. By changing the rules around his mother's legacy, he made it much harder for similar questions or disputes to surface again later. The transfer also pointed to a wider shift inside the monarchy itself. It highlighted the growing divide between the current generation of royals and the one that is expected to lead next. William was not just acting as Diana's son, protecting a deeply personal memory. He was also moving like the future king, someone thinking about institutions, tradition, and the weight that comes with leadership. Even before he officially takes the throne, William appears determined to help shape the monarchy he will one day inherit, and this decision suggested that when it comes to protecting what he believes matters most, he is willing to use every legitimate option available to him. The transfer of Diana's ring created a clear line between the present reign and the one to come. But could that also hint at the kind of monarchy William wants to lead? What changes might he introduce when his time finally comes? Will he stay close to his father's approach, or will he choose a path that reflects his own vision? Let's look at what that could mean. The kind of king William may become is exactly where this story starts to get even more interesting, because once you move past Diana's sapphire ring, the paperwork and the palace disagreement, his decision seems to point to something much bigger. It may have given people a glimpse of the kind of monarch he wants to be one day. For years, Prince William has spoken, at least in broad terms, about the future of the monarchy. Alongside Catherine, he has come to represent a newer generation of royals who seem focused on meaningful change while still holding on to the traditions that have defined the family for generations. Many observers believe that this more modern approach could end up influencing the monarchy for decades. That is part of why the vault decision drew so much attention. William did not turn it into a public showdown, and he did not seem interested in attention or applause. Instead, according to the version being discussed online, he took a quieter route, examined the situation carefully, gathered the needed documents, followed the formal process, and put a solution in place that was meant to stand the test of time. To many viewers, that approach has become a big part of how his leadership style is being read. According to people familiar with William's approach, he is seen by some as the kind of monarch who would be ready to make tough calls if he believes the future of the institution is on the line. Some observers have even suggested that, while King Charles is often viewed as leading with personal relationships and emotion in mind, William appears to lean more toward planning, strategy, and the long game. Seen through that lens, the move involving Diana's collection takes on a much bigger meaning. William was clearly dealing with something deeply personal. The ring stood for his mother, his memories, and a powerful piece of family history. But instead of relying on emotion alone, he reportedly turned to official channels and proper procedures to protect what he felt needed safeguarding. That mix is what makes the moment so compelling. It showed a son honoring his mother's legacy, while also showing a future king thinking about duty, authority, and the institution he may one day lead. So maybe the real takeaway from that day at Windsor was not just about Diana's ring at all, but about William quietly showing how he may choose to use power when his time arrives, with caution, purpose, and a very clear sense of direction. That is why the reaction has not faded, even as the details keep getting rehashed online. For some people, the key point is not whether the move looked dramatic, but whether it reflected a more controlled, more deliberate style of leadership. Others, however, have questioned whether handling something so closely tied to Diana in such a formal way inevitably turns a private family matter into a larger public statement. And once that idea takes hold, the conversation shifts fast. What began as discussion about one item in the royal vault starts to look like a test of how William manages pressure, legacy, and the expectations that come with his position. Supporters see restraint and long-term thinking. Critics see a move that may have carried more symbolism than the palace likely wanted to acknowledge. That split is exactly what keeps the debate alive. The online discussion is no longer only about a ring, it is about what people think William values, how he handles sensitive decisions, and whether his approach signals a different kind of monarchy taking shape behind the scenes. So the focus naturally turns to the larger pattern people think they are seeing. If this is how William handles one of the most personal parts of his family history, then observers are left wondering what that says about the choices he may make later, when the responsibilities are even heavier and the spotlight is even brighter. Beyond William's clear determination to protect what he believes gives the monarchy its value, people have still been asking a bigger question. Was his move to safeguard his mother's legacy ever made public, and has he truly secured Diana's story for the generations ahead? Now the focus turns to the signature that reportedly changed the course of that story forever. The decision tied to Diana's legacy unfolded without any grand royal announcement, public celebration, or polished ceremony for the cameras. There was no crowd gathered nearby, no official speech, and no dramatic scene outside the palace gates. Instead, the moment that locked in one of the most meaningful parts of Princess Diana's legacy was said to have ended in the quietest way possible. With one carefully placed signature, a lasting chapter in royal history was written. The completed documents were then secured inside the vault, marking a step that could shape Diana's legacy for years to come. And without any attention or fanfare, Prince William reportedly left Windsor Castle, got back into his car, and headed home to spend the rest of the day with Catherine and their children, as if nothing unusual had happened. But behind that simple ending was a decision carrying huge personal and institutional weight. What may have looked like a quiet administrative step actually pointed to something much bigger. It became a statement about who would protect Diana's story, who would preserve her memory, and who would ultimately have a voice in the future of the belongings most closely tied to her life. According to the version being discussed, the transfer added a lasting layer of protection around Diana's personal collection. Rather than leaving those items exposed to changing circumstances, future administrations, or shifting palace priorities, the arrangement reportedly placed them under the care of the family members with the strongest connection to her. And maybe the most revealing part was not the object itself, but what the move seemed to say about William. He did not chase attention. He did not turn it into a public confrontation. He did not need headlines to make his position clear. Instead, he focused on building a permanent solution, one that could hold long after the surrounding conversation had moved on. That approach offered a small glimpse of the kind of leader William may become, a king who seems to understand that some of the most important choices are not always made in front of cameras. Sometimes they happen quietly, through careful planning, patience, and a strong sense of duty. Whether people agree with every part of it or not, the message behind the move still lands with real weight. Diana's legacy was not left to chance. William appeared determined to make sure the memories, belongings, and symbols tied to his mother would have protection that could last well into the future. In doing that, he was not only honoring Diana's past, he was also helping shape the path he may one day lead. If this story about the ring and the vault made you think differently about William's role, like, subscribe, share this with someone following the royal discussion, comment your take below, and see you on the next one.